Welcome back to Refit and Sail. My name's George Isted, the Solent Boat Butler, and this is a Contessa 32. She's a mid-70s boat that is with me for a fairly extensive refit. I've been doing all sorts of work on the bottom, internally. I've currently got the engine out and I've been crawling around the engine bay for the last week, and work continues this week on the engine and getting the engine bay finished so that I can carry on with some other works internally. Keep watching for lots of Contessa refit fun. If you've been watching the series, in the last 2 episodes, you will have seen that I took the engine out of the engine bay, and that's currently in the workshop. I needed to do that to take a bulkhead out at the back of the engine bay so I could get to the top of the skeg. I had to do that because the top of the skeg was full of absolutely soaking wet foam. So I've removed that foam. I've put a new stern tube into the boat. I've refilled that void with new foam. That's a mixture of foaming epoxy, where I needed a structural epoxy around the old stern tube, and then polyurethane foam on top of that. That's then been glassed over. I have then fitted a brand new bulkhead into the engine bay because the old one didn't fit brilliantly well. So that's gone back in. I've flow coated everything, and now I need to sort out the engine beds because the engine was very misaligned. And I've run out of adjustment on the existing engine mounts, so I've got to make some new engine beds for it to fit properly. I need to put sound insulation in there. I think I'm going to put some lighting in there for the owner. I'm also going to give the engine a bit of a birthday. That's around in the workshop, and that's what I'm going to look at next. But first, I'm going to take the engine panel from the boat here because it makes it easier to start it, and it saves me having to use a screwdriver effectively to hotwire it on the starter motor. That's the engine panel. It's a very basic one. I'm going to be unscrewing that, and then whilst I'm here, because I know that we're going to be replacing the batteries anyway, I'm going to pull those batteries out because I'm going to use those around in the workshop to run the engine up. I'm now around in my workshop, and it's a little bit untidy in here. I apologise. Still trying to sort it out. It's very, very cold in the UK at the moment. It's about -1, so you can probably see my breath. But down here is Lottie's 2GM. There you go, that's a much better view without my face in the way. So I gave it a bit of a clean yesterday. It's a reasonably tidy engine. The owner tells me that it starts and runs pretty well. We're not replacing it as part of the refit, so my plan is to plumb that up with some power and some diesel, and then run it up in the workshop because, one, it doesn't have any antifreeze in it and it is very cold. It should be okay because it's salt water in it, but even so, it really ought to have antifreeze in it for long-term storage. Secondly, it needs a service, and thirdly, I'm going to run some descaler through it. So one of the problems you've got with marine engines is they live on boats and they are cooled by seawater, and seawater has all sorts of stuff in it which leaves deposits in the engine. So on this engine, it's raw water cooled. That means it's cooled by the seawater flowing directly around the engine. Now there is a freshwater cooled or heat exchanger cooled version of this engine, but this is kind of the lighter version that was available at the time. We can clean all those deposits out of the waterways in the engine, or if it was a heat exchanger cooled engine, we could cool it. We could clean the heat exchanger out with basically this stuff. So it is essentially just an acid, which is safe to use on engines. You can run it around the cooling waterways, ideally when it's nice and warm, and it basically dissolves all the rubbish that has built up and furred up in those waterways. So I'm going to do that as part of the service here today. And there we go. It's taken me a few minutes just to plumb this in, just to show you what I've done. I've got the fuel filter that's actually off the boat, so I've temporarily screwed that into the side of the engine bay. So I've got a hose there which is going to go into a can of diesel, and that goes into the fuel filter. That hose then runs round, goes to the lift pump, which is on this side here. So that's the lift pump just there. That then goes into the fine filter, which is there, and into the high pressure pump. So there is also a fuel return line, so that comes off the second injector and that will just drop straight back into that fuel can. So on the power side, we've got a positive lead there going onto the solenoid. that is running straight to the battery, and then I've got a negative on the battery straight onto the block there, so that's all good. And then I've simply had to plug in the standard control panel there, so that was dead easy. That was just plug and play. And then lastly, I need to think about water cooling. So normally the water comes into the raw water pump here and then gets pumped up. So there's a thermostat in there normally, and that controls whether the water goes around the block or whether it just gets spat out the exhaust. I've bypassed the hose that would normally go from there to the exhaust, and it's just going to return the water down to the bucket, where it's also going to be sucking water from into the raw water pump. So that's all good. I just need to bleed the fuel system, which I will do in a minute. And the other slight problem I have at the moment is I need some water, and the pipes are frozen here. So I'm going to go for a hunt, see if I can find a running tap to get some water, so I have some water to keep the engine cool. I've got all the fuel system bled. I've managed to find some water by getting some from the toilets there. There's no reason this shouldn't start other than the fact that it's extremely cold. In fact, it's kind of sleety snowing outside at the moment. It's about -1, so I am not expecting this to be easy to start. In fact, I've got 2 batteries, so if it doesn't start on the first one, I can swap them over and crank on the second one. But we shall see. Here goes the first attempt. Well, that's good. It's a bit smoky in here now. I think I'm going to open the door and give it another go. But actually, that started really easily. So it may be that this is a very healthy engine after all. Right, well, I've just opened the big double door that's right there out of shot. So hopefully that smoke will clear now. And we can get it running for a little bit longer and get it nicely warmed up. Well, it has to be said, I am pretty pleased with how well that engine started. It is really properly cold in here, and it's just sitting there quite happily at tick over. So I'm going to give it some revs and get it nice and warm, and then get on with some of the jobs. Now, with the engine nice and warm, you can probably see a bit of steam rising from my bucket of water that's just down here. I'm going to change the oil. So the easiest way to do that is to use a vac pump. So I've had one of these for donkey's years. It is getting a bit tired, so I might have to invest in a new one soon. But you simply take the dipstick out, shove the suction hose down the hole, and away you go. You just pump the thing, and the receptacle fills up with all the old oil. So here's the dipstick. I'm going to pull that out, give it a little wipe. The oil's not that dirty, but given that servicing the engine is so easy and oil is pretty cheap, it seems silly not to do it. So I'm going to chuck the vac hose down there, and then I can pump away. Doing this with cold oil would not be an easy task, but doing it with nice warm oil, it sucks out relatively easily. Now, if you've seen my earlier videos, you'll know I also have an electric pump, but I have not got it with me. It's on my own boat at the moment, so I'm using the manual one for this. The electric pumps are really good. You just plug it onto the nearest battery. You can even just normally have crock clips on, and you can clip it onto the positive terminal on the starter motor, and then put the negative somewhere on the block, and away you go. They're really, really useful. But the oil has to be warm, because otherwise Those things really struggle with viscous cold oil. This is going to take a few minutes, and once it's done, I'm going to spin the oil filter off, which is down this side here, which you can't see. Stick a new one on. Here are all my goodies that I picked up from Marine Power, which is my local Yanmar dealer. Really nice people to deal with, by the way. So in here is a new oil filter, hopefully, and you don't have to buy genuine parts for these engines, but you definitely know it's going to fit. In theory, what you could do is take the old oil filter into a motor factor, and they will maybe cross-reference it and find you the appropriate alternative. I have done that in the past, but sometimes it's just not worth the effort when you can just buy the bits straight from a dealer. So I need to take the plastic off this, and then before it goes on, I just put a tiny little smear of clean engine oil on there, spin it up. It just needs to be hand tight. There we go. Not too tight, and we'll check that for leaks when I run the engine up in just a minute. From memory, the engine takes about 3.5 litres of oil, but I'll stick maybe 2.5 in, check it on the dipstick, and then just keep topping it from there. Normally you can see how much has come out, but I've gone and put the vac pump away somewhere, so I can't quite see it. Hopefully I can get this in without pouring all over the engine. So I'll let that drain down to the sump, and then check it on the dipstick. I did drizzle a bit all over the rocker cover there, but never mind. One of the things you've got to remember when you are changing the oil in your engine and you're filling it back up again is that you've changed the filter, and you need to refill that filter because the dipstick will be calibrated for a filter full of oil. So I'm going to quickly run the engine just for 30 seconds. That's going to get the oil all the way around the engine, and then I'll let it sink down again to the sump whilst I'm changing the engine anodes, and then I'll check it again, and if we're all good, then I shall leave it there, or I will top it up as necessary. Next job's the engine anodes, and in this box, hopefully, I should have, there we go, 2 little anodes. You can see that little metal thing in there. In fact, get it out so you can see it. So on this engine, there are 2 engine anodes to protect the engine. So these get eaten away instead of the engine block. And there's one that goes inside and one that goes in the back. They're often forgotten about, and they are actually pretty important. I used to find on my old Contessa that had one of these engines, I'd have to replace these about every 2 years. And by the second year, they were about 70% wasted. So popping them in is fairly straightforward, but the nuts which hold them in can be extremely difficult to undo. So I'm going to go and get a very big spanner and see if I can loosen them off. I'm going to start on this back one and see if it wants to come off or not. And I can put an extending bar on this. Oh, there we go. It has to be said, doing this when you're not doing it at full arm stretch across an engine bay is much, much easier. So there is going to be a dribble of water coming out of this, I expect. Let's just get some tissue. Chuck that there. And I would not be at all surprised if there is no anode on this. We shall see. Oh, hold on a minute. There is an anode, so this engine has been serviced and looked after. Well, I'm actually not going to replace that because that one is still in pretty good condition. It's about 95% there, so I'm going to clean that up and chuck it back in. Well, as you can possibly see there, it has been eaten away very slightly, so it is doing its job. But as this is kind of still 90% there, I see no reason to change this. I don't like throwing things out unnecessarily. These anodes are reasonably expensive, so given that it's got at least a year, if not 2 years of use left in it, I'm just going to chuck it straight back in. I'm going to put a tiny little bit of grease on the threads just to make it easy for the next person to get this out, and it can go straight back in its hole. Now, I know it's not my money, but I actually don't believe in wasting customers' money. There's nothing wrong with that anode. Oh. So we'll do that up nice and tight. It's got a copper washer underneath there which you crush as you do that up. Now I'm going to see if I can get onto the side one, which is going to be slightly more difficult. As I suspected, and as is often the case, the difficult one doesn't get replaced, and I've just pulled the anode out and there is not exactly a lot left of it, so I suspect this one is an awful lot older than the one on the back, so I'll stick a new one in here. So he has one new one and one very nearly new one, and he should be good for a year or two, I would have thought. But you should really check them every year. I ended up replacing them and checking them and replacing them every 2 years on my engine just because I got to know it. But different conditions, different engines all wear their anodes at a different rate. If you have a heat exchanger cooled engine, you may find that the anodes are in the heat exchanger. That's certainly the case on Beta Marine diesel engines, and their little pencil anodes do tend to get eaten away quite quickly. You may not even get a year out, you may only get 6 months out of them, so they are worth checking fairly regularly, and certainly have some on board so you can swap them out if you need to. Now, these things are super easy to swap over. They just screw in normally. There we go. So I can now unscrew the old one, and what sometimes goes missing is there's a little rubber washer there, and I did buy new washers because I've done so many of these engines where the washers have been missing. Well, I thought I'd get some when I get the new anodes, but that rubber washer is in good enough condition that we can reuse it, and I shall get my new anode. Might do stick a tiny bit of grease on there just to make sure it has a good electrical contact. Again, most people probably don't bother, but if you keep the water out of the screw joint, then you can kind of ensure you get a good electrical ground between the two items. There we go. Doesn't need to be done up super tight, just finger tight. I'm going to clean the thread up on that with a wire brush, put a bit of grease on it, and then chuck it back in the engine. Go back in there. Now, having done the anodes, I'm going to go and check the oil level again on the dipstick, so I'm going to give it a little wipe. Chuck it back in, pull it back out, and we are absolutely, probably doesn't show on the thing, but we're absolutely bang on the top mark, so that is just what we want. It's almost as though I checked it before filming this, but I promise I didn't. That was a bit of luck. I was expecting to have to top it up a touch. This here is the Gearbox dipstick, so slightly different to the engine oil dipstick, because what you have to do is unscrew it, clean it, and then you put it back in, but you do not screw it up. You just rest the threads on the top. Now, there's a little mark just there. I don't know if you can see that, maybe just about. We rest that on the top, pull it out, and you can see the oil is up to there and the mark is down there. So this is massively overfilled. So the oil looks quite clean, but we're going to suck it out and put some fresh stuff in there to the right level. Problem is this oil is viscous because it's cold. It's got probably a tiny bit of warmth from the engine, but hardly any, so it's going to take a little while to suck this out. That's the gearbox topped up to the correct level, so if I drop that in there down to the threads, lift it up, and I don't know if you can see that, but it is just up to the line. Struggling to get it to focus on that, but you just have to take my word for it. No longer overfilled. I think it takes probably about 200 mils. I didn't measure it as it went in, but if you check the handbook for your engine, you will be able to find out. Also in my box of service items, I have got a new air filter. Now this is just kind of like a piece of foam on a piece of mesh. Now these do tend to disintegrate after a while, so it is worth replacing them. You don't have to replace them every year. Obviously servicing to some extent depends on the hours you're putting on your engine, but I thought because we don't know the history of the engine, we're going to stick a new one in. So that is just a matter of pulling off the air filter. Here's the old one. It is looking a little bit dirty and a little bit crusty. It's got a bit of rust on it, so that can go in the bin. Get those bits of rust out. That goes back in there. And then it just clips back on. Easy peasy. So the other thing you change when you're doing a service normally is the fine fuel filter. That goes in this little housing there, so I'm going to replace that. The other thing is the water pump impeller, which is that thing for the raw water pump, which is down the front here. I showed you it earlier. I'm not going to replace this right now, and there's a very good reason for that. If I replace it now, it's going to spend the next few months all kind of scrunched up like that. So a far better thing to do is to just have this ready to go in when the boat's relaunched. Pop the new impeller in, and you know you've got a brand new impeller that hasn't sat for months and months and months, all scrunched up, and it should work perfectly. Hopefully you can see that a bit better. I've moved the camera slightly closer. There's a knurled nut here, and the reason it's knurled is so that you can get your screwdriver on it and give it a little tap. It's like not really so much a nut as a sealing ring, so I'm just going to put some tissue under there, and then I'm going to get my screwdriver, put it against one of those little knurls or little higher points, and just give it a little tap. Definitely helps if you do it the right way. You can then unscrew this little fuel bowl which contains the fine fuel filter. Now this fuel bowl is full of fuel, and what you also need to do is kind of wiggle the fuel filter off so it sits in the fuel bowl. There we go. Here is the old one, and there's a little bit of stuff in the bottom there, so I'm going to give that a clean, and then I'll put the new fuel filter in. I've just disposed of the fuel that was in here by actually pouring it back into the can, because anything that's in that can is going to go through a filter anyway. So when I said this was dirty, I'm not actually sure if it was or it wasn't. It's just there's some grubbiness down the bottom there. Just looks like maybe a little bit of sediment that's collected. So just give it a good clean. Right. And here's the little rubber O-ring that seals it all, so I'm just going to give that a little clean as well. That sits over the top of there. You can normally reuse them, so I didn't buy a new one of these. There we go. Get the new filter out. I've got to be honest, on my old 2GM, I used to replace these about every 2 years. I didn't replace them every service because the majority of the rubbish gets caught in the primary fuel filter. And also, I had my tank cleaned, so I knew it was pretty clean and I was unlikely to have too much rubbish in it. Of course, that's a slightly dangerous game, I suppose. To some extent, you never know quite how good the fuel is that you're filling up with. So probably a case of do as I say, don't do as I do, and do change it every service. Right, there we go. That's as clean as it needs to be. Pop this down. Let's locate the end of the filter. And you can normally just push it straight back up where it needs to go. There we go. That's located the filter. I just used the housing to put it onto the little spigot, I suppose, that's in there. And there's a little rubber washer inside the end of the filter, just in there, and that holds it in place, seals it all. Now we can do up the filter housing and the fuel bowl around it. And it takes a little bit of care so that you don't cross thread. Then we do it up finger tight, and then I'm going to get my screwdriver again, stick it in one of those little recesses, and that will do. So it doesn't need to be super tight. What I do need to do, of course, now is to bleed that so that it's full of fuel and not full of air again. So I need a 12mm spanner. Open it up, get some more tissue, and then I can reach down and use my fuel lift pump, which is just here. Pump until I get fuel coming out of here. Which can take sometimes a little bit of pumping. Ooh. There we go. Do it up loosely. There we go. With the fuel filter changed, the only thing left that I want to do is run it up again just to make sure I haven't got any air bubbles in the fuel circuit, but also I now want to run the descaler through it. So I've just put this in a bucket, added some water, so I'm going to run it up, leave that in it for a while, get it nice and hot, and then I'm going to go home, get some lunch, and then I will come back, probably turn it over, let it run for a little bit longer to get it nice and warm again, just to give the descaler a chance to really do its job, and then I will fill it up with antifreeze and she's done. With the engine basically done back in the workshop, it's ready to go back into the hole, but the hole is not ready for the engine yet. So I'm going to crack on with that next. But before I do that, I don't have any hoses between the new Cockpit drains and the new Seacocks that I fitted in the last episode. So I'm going to be using some of this stuff. It is a fire retardant, heat resistant hose. It also has a wire in the hose as well. So if you put it through quite a tight curve, bend like that, it won't collapse on you. You can use bog standard water hose, but it's not a brilliant idea, particularly if it's in an engine bay. Now this isn't going to go in an engine bay because I've got that new bulkhead that I fitted in there, so it's separate from the engine bay, but I think it's good practice to have a fire retardant hose in there anyway. Here's a quick top tip. I was just tidying up the end of the hose which I'm using for these Cockpit drains, and I'm not sure quite how they cut these at my supplier, but it looked like a dog had been chewing on it. But I like a nice flat end, but we still have this wire to cut. Now if you're in this situation, do not use your side cutters, which are designed for cutting you know, copper wire, for example, or zip ties and that sort of thing. They are just going to be damaged if you try and cut this steel wire that is inside a hose. What you need are some proper wire cutters like this. These have got hardened steel blades, and they chop through that wire that is in the hose really, really easily without damaging anything. If you try and do it with these, all you're going to do is end up swearing and damaging your tool. There you can see I've drilled a big hole for the exhaust hose, a slightly smaller hole there for the control cables to go through. Down the bottom we've got a couple of holes for letting water run through, so they are limber holes just to let the compartment aft of that bulkhead to escape. And back here I have finally got the hoses on for the Cockpit drains, so they're all double clipped as they should be. It keeps the surveyors happy, and thankfully that is the last bit of work I think I need to do right at the back of kind of the engine bay behind that bulkhead, because access is not easy. As you can see, back in the engine bay, and I'm just looking at the best way to go about doing the sound insulation. What I normally do is do the very top first. So this piece here, as you can see, there are some battens that have been glassed into that. So I need to shape the piece of sound insulation so that it goes over that. You've kind of got two options. You either put in kind of 5 pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you shape your piece of sound insulation so that you cut some sections out of it so you can glue the whole thing up and it fits over. I tend to do the latter. The other reason I tend to do the top first is that when I then put the side pieces on, the side pieces go up against the top piece and it helps hold the top piece in place. Although I will be putting some mechanical fixings in as well just to hold the sound insulation in place. Here's an offcut of the sound insulation that I'll be using. It's about 1 inch thick, maybe it's just a smidge less than that. It's got a polymetric barrier in it, apparently. I think that's that plastic bit there. So it's foam, polymetric barrier, more foam, and then it has this kind of foil surface. I've used this on loads of boats, and I've used it on my own boat as well. And it seems to last pretty well, seems to do a pretty good job. It's not too thick. You can get thicker and more expensive and obviously heavier in weight bits of sound insulation, but you know, there's only so much space in a Contessa engine bay, so this is going to be miles better than what was on there before. Here is the first section of sound insulation I've cut. You can see I've taken kind of a slice out of each one, and those correspond nicely with the battens under there. So that everything has just been given a coat of contact adhesive, so I'm just waiting for that adhesive just to dry a little bit, and then I can stick that up in position. Once it's up, I'm going to be using some of these little extra supports, so you can stick a screw through the middle there and screw up into those battens just to help support the weight of the sound insulation. Welcome to a somewhat shinier engine bay. You can see, if I move the camera around, I've got part way through doing it. I haven't done the sides, either side. I've got a little way to go, but I've almost run out of the sound insulation that I had. But the good news is my order is going to turn up tomorrow with another box of 4 sheets. So that should be, I'm hoping, just about enough for me to finish the engine bay, but we will find out tomorrow. I apologise, I haven't really shown you the process of cutting it up, but it's quite simple. I kind of take measurements, you can see some of them written down there. I then transfer that over to the sound insulation. I then use a straight edge. I'm using some of this aluminium angle, laying that on top, cutting it with a sharp knife. So I've got loads and loads of blades for these things because it does like being cut with a very sharp knife and they blunt relatively quickly, so I just snap them off or swap them out for new ones. The edges of the material, if it's going to be on show or if I think it's going to get wet, it all gets taped with silver foil tape. So if you look inside, kind of like the edges all around there have all been taped, and it's the same down the bottom there. All the edges where there may potentially be some water, that's going to get taped. Now I do need to open up where those drain holes are slightly, so I'm going to run the hole saw through from the other side, and then I again will tape up the bit that I've cut. So that should work out very nicely. Now you can't have too much of a good thing. It's 5 o'clock, it's dark outside, it is getting very, very cold, and it's time for me to put some food in my stomach, so I shall continue tomorrow. It's now the next day and I am waiting for a delivery of engine sound insulation. So whilst I'm waiting for that to turn up, I thought I would start on the Cutlass bearing and thinking about the engine beds. So here is the Cutlass bearing I'm going to be putting in. It was a bit of a tight fit in there. I know that that has been made to the right spec, but I think this was just ever so slightly oversized. Well, maybe not oversized, but there just wasn't enough gap for clearance to get it in and out. It needs to be an interference fit, so it needs to be a fairly tight fit in there. But when you can't even get the tip in, then you know it's not quite right. So all I've done is given it a bit of a polish with some wet and dry paper. I've just repositioned you on the other side because I'm right-handed and I need to stand where the camera was. Now this should go in fairly easily. I have my rubber mallet, and I'm going to put a piece of wood on there as well, just so that I'm hitting it square. So next up, to make sure that this cannot spin, it shouldn't spin because it's a reasonably tight, snug fit in there, but to make sure it can't spin is I want to drill a couple of holes in here, which I'm then going to tap, and I'm going to put a grub screw on each side from the outside of the boat into the Cutlass bearing. Now, drill size for an M6 tap is 5mm, which is convenient because I haven't got my tap drills here, but unfortunately just a bog standard 5mm is what I need. So I'm going to go in probably at a slight angle and then straighten up, just because of the shape of this. Getting it to go straight is going to be quite difficult off the bat, so I will just make a little dimple and I'm going to straighten up the drill. So I'm going in sideways, I'm going to go all the way through this bonding, through the tube, and I'm actually going to go through the Cutlass bearing as well, and I'm going to tap the whole thing all the way through. There's my dimple. Cool, right, one down, I'll do the other side. Giving that a good clean because we don't want any of the brass swarf in the rubber Cutlass bearing damaging anything. So I'll also put the vacuum on that a bit later just to suck anything out. Right, I need to cut a thread. Here's my M6 tap, if the camera will focus on it. Now normally if you were tapping into metal you would use some cutting fluid on the thing that you're trying to put a thread into, but you don't really need to do that because I'm mostly cutting into glass fibre. It's actually thickened epoxy with silica in it, so it's nice and hard, and then there's a tiny bit of brass at the end, but brass is so soft we can get away without cutting fluid. That is not going to be a problem at all. The only problem I might have is that I am potentially going to, there we go, it's off. I'm potentially going to have these touch there in a minute, but we'll see if we can get all the way through. I might just do it. go, that's all the way through. Perfect. There we go. Beautiful. Now, just to make sure that these little grub screws don't vibrate loose, I am going to put a small amount of thread locker on. So some of this stuff will do nicely. So I'm just going to chuck a little dab on there. It's kind of a medium strength thread locker. And then chuck him in the hole. Now I'm winding this in so it goes all the way through into the brass shell, but we don't want it going into the rubber. So I'm looking very closely and winding it back slightly, and there we go. Do the same on the other side, if I can find the grub screw in my pocket. There we go, that's the Cutlass now in place with a couple of grub screws just holding it. This will eventually get a coating of the grey High Protect on it in due course, but I've got some other bits and pieces that need High Protect and it's just too cold to apply it at the moment. So that can sit like that for the time being, and I can get on with looking at the alignment. Here is the prop shaft that came out of Lottie right at the start of the project. And I've just given it a clean with some wet and dry paper just because it was all a bit grotty on the shaft, so that I could see what was going on underneath the dirt. Now at the back end here, this is the bit that runs on the Cutlass bearing. It is a little bit worn. I can feel it's slightly worn with my fingers, and there's some ridges here which aren't particularly nice. It's not brilliant in itself. I don't think it completely condemns the shaft, but it's less than ideal, because if you've got wear on the shaft and you put a new Cutlass bearing in, the problem is that you've got more clearance there than it's really designed to have, and that will wear or accelerate the wear on the new Cutlass bearing. Now, moving along the shaft, you can see here, this is the damage that was caused by it rattling and bouncing off the side of the old stern tube. So it did have a stainless steel stern tube in here, which wasn't the original one. It was leaking, it's come out. It's slightly unusual to have a stainless steel stern tube, but there you go. Unfortunately, it was so badly aligned, this engine, that that damage has been caused to the shaft there. Moving up further, there are some slight ridges here and here where the old stern gland were also wearing on the shaft. So I'm going to stick this in and see where all those ridges end up inside the boat, and take it from there. Now, if you haven't seen it or done it before, it may not be completely obvious what I am trying to achieve to get the engine beds all aligned. Now, I put the Cutlass bearing in because the Cutlass is going to hold that prop shaft absolutely centrally in the stern tube on the outside. Now, what I do on the inside to centralize the prop shaft is I use some little plastic bungs like this. These are machined, so it's a 1-inch hole in there, and the outside diameter of this is the inside diameter of the stern tube. So I can shove this up the hole and it centralizes the prop shaft in the stern tube. I can then go and get my engine jig, which I can bolt or mount to the prop shaft coupling, put the prop shaft coupling on the stern tube, and then with my engine jig I can see where all the mounting holes need to be on the engine beds. So that gets me really very close to having the engine really nicely aligned. Now, the old engine beds, I'm hoping that I can reuse them and just drill new holes in them in the right location, because I can't use the old holes because there just isn't enough adjustment on the feet. So once I've drilled new holes, I can get them in very nearly the right location, then can take it all out, put the stern gland in, put the prop shaft back in, mount the engine, and then hopefully I'll be able to just with a small amount of adjustment that is available on the feet, get the engine absolutely perfectly aligned, so we won't have any of the issues that the boat came with. Now you might wonder, why don't I just use the engine rather than using an engine jig? Well, engines, moving them in and out of engine bays, fortunately with small engines it's not too bad, but they are kind of big, heavy, hefty things. So if you can get an engine jig, which is quite light, quite easy to maneuver, you can put it in and out of the engine bay as many times as you like without breaking your back or damaging the engine or damaging the boat. So using an engine jig is definitely the way to go. Now I know it doesn't look like it, but that is a Yanmar diesel engine. It's a 2GM and a 3GM, depending on which holes you use for working out where everything needs to sit. If I go round the side, you can see the slight issue I've got is that it's nowhere near where it needs to be for the prop shaft. So I think I've measured that as about 50 mil out. So I'm gonna have to possibly do some surgery to these engine beds to get things to line up properly. Sometimes when you're having an issue with a project and things aren't quite going to plan, you just need to step away and go and have a cup of tea and have a good think about it, which is exactly what I have just done. I've come back now refreshed, and I've also gone and got a couple of engine mounts out of my workshop. So this jig is designed to use Yanmar engine mounts, and I had a spare one sitting in my workshop. So that's quite a hefty thing. These are about £200 each. They are quite expensive, but they're quite good engine mounts, to be fair. The engine mounts on Lottie are these, and there is quite a big difference in the height of these two engine mounts if you look at them. So that makes up for why I'm having such a big issue getting that thing to fit in the engine bay. So what I'm going to do is go and recalibrate the engine jig. I'm basically going to move where the prop shaft attached to the engine jig so that the levels that I'm working to are for these engine mounts and not the standard Yanmar ones. So that should make things look much, much better, because I really didn't want to get into rebuilding all those engine beds, because that's a much, much bigger job than really is necessary at this stage, because the owner has suggested that he may only keep this particular engine in the boat for another 2, 3, 4 years. He'll see how it goes and then possibly swap it for a new one. But at the moment, swapping the engine's out of budget, so we want to try and get the old engine back in the boat at a reasonable cost to him. So I have just ordered 4 brand new mounts like these, because these are looking a little bit tired. I've cleaned this one up, but the other 3 on the engine are looking a bit sad. So I've got those turning up tomorrow, hopefully. So I'm going to get that engine jig out and do some very careful measuring and then adjust it so that I can use it for these mounts. And there you can see the engine jig is in place. I've managed to locate the prop shaft into the shaft clamp. The shaft clamp is on the back of the jig and it all just about fits. I had to just chop the little corners off at the back there to get it to actually go in, but that's not a problem because that was just kind of like spare material on the jig. So I'm pretty happy that I can get that to fit using the flexi mounts that are going to be turning up tomorrow, which should be identical to the ones that came out. Just taken the jig out now, and you can see the little drill marks that I've put in here. And what I've done before I take the engine beds out is I've just double checked and cross-referenced everything, so the distance between the holes on the port and starboard side match the drawings, about 370 mil, and everything's kind of in a line, so my jig has done its job and I think we're good to go. The rest of my day has been taken up with continuing with the soundproofing. So you can see I took those engine beds out again, and then I've been climbing in and out to put some more of this sound insulation in, but it's now nearly 7 o'clock in the evening and my stomach is rumbling, so I need to go get some food, and tomorrow is a new day. It's now the afternoon of the next day and I really don't know where the time goes, but this morning I took the metal engine beds round to a friend of mine who's got a really nice metal working shop, machinist shop, and he drilled and tapped the new holes in those metal engine beds for me. We also took the prop off the prop shaft and had a proper look at that, had a conversation with the owner, and we've decided to put a new prop shaft in the boat. So I've currently got the new prop shaft in the engine bay, although it hasn't had its taper cut onto it yet, but I need a prop shaft for doing engine alignment. Today is Wednesday and I'm going to try, I'm not sure if it's going to be possible or not, I'm going to try and get the engine back into the boat and in its hole on Friday if I can. If not, it will definitely be Monday. So once the engine beds were all ready, I've then taken them around to my workshop, given them a good clean, a buzz over with a wire brush and an angle grinder, and given them a coat of primer, and then I'm going to pop back later once that has fully dried to give them a coat of paint. So hopefully that means I'll be able to stick them back in tomorrow. So what I want to do now is to carry on with the engine sound insulation. It's mostly done in terms of the fixed parts. I've got a bit of taping up to do around all the edges, and then I've got the two opening parts of the engine bay on each side. So there's the new access panel that will need sound insulation, and the removable panel up the quarter berth that needs sound insulation. There's the engine bay. It's pretty much done in there on the sound insulation front. I've had quite a good afternoon just finishing all that off, doing the removable panels on both sides. All the edges are pretty much taped. The only thing I've got left to do is have a bit of a tidy up in there because there's a bit of dust and a bit of a mess. And I've got two small sections, one each side, one on that side and one on that side low down. I need to do those, but I've left those for the time being on purpose because I've still got to put the proper flooring on top of this kind of scrappy wood. So once that's in, I can just put those two last little pieces in. So I'm pretty pleased with that. Looks good. There we have the engine beds back in place in their red colouring for extra performance and extra speed. It's looking pretty nice in there now. I have put those engine beds back in with new stainless steel fixings because I couldn't quite bring myself to put them back in with the mild steel ones that were a little bit rusty that came out. And all I need now is an engine. It's now Friday morning. It is still very, very cold. I have an engine in my workshop that is ready to go in. I've got engine beds, as you have seen. I have the new stern gland that fits. I've just checked it, so that's all good. And I have been sent some engine mounts, and here are the new engine mounts. Unfortunately, they have sent me the wrong ones. These are the ones that I need. They're blue and they are soft, and they've sent me the black hard ones. So unfortunately the engine will not be going in this week after all. I also have a slight issue with my van, which is an unfortunate story which I won't go into, but you can see the picture. You're going to have to stay tuned for next week's episode when I'll get the engine dropped into the boat. I'll do all the engine alignment. I'll show you how to do that, and hopefully we'll have everything all pretty much in and connected. In last week's video, I put a piece in about the fact that you can now buy me a beer if you enjoy my videos, and quite a few of you did drop me a few pounds or a few dollars into my PayPal account, and the PayPal account is in the description if you want to buy me a beer this week. Thank you very, very much. You've been very generous, and anything that isn't spent on beer may get spent on new windscreens or new cameras or microphones, which make the channel better for you. So thanks very much again. Right, I'll bring it to a close here. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.